Okay. My colleague got quite sick yesterday, so I have to. We work together in a project looking at the carbon emissions from animal products based on land use. So I will do two things lousy today, moderating and doing a presentation, because I didn't have the time to prepare anything as good as when I heard about this sickness yesterday. However, there will be some, to the last question you put, I think that I will come up with some here discussion, because when we come to discussing these things, we have to look also into bioenergy. And I think this is very important to have in memory, that we have this huge demand for land already today, but also in future. And if we look already today, we have around 75% of all agricultural land is used for livestock production, and this is because we have so large area of pastures in the world, and about 1/3 of the cropland is used for feeding the animals up to that. But we also have these climate policies that we are quite sure that we will have an increased demand for biomass. So there is a big demand for agricultural land. And I will talk a bit about the difficulties and the challenges where you are going to look at including the effects of land use, occupation and transformation when you do carbon footprinting to find the best alternative. And I will give you an example from a research I have done to look at land use change emission from the cattle in Brazilian beef, and then talk about emissions and sequestration from land use, and that is about basically following up of what Keith have talked about, and just giving you some idea of how much this can be in a carbon footprint of animal products. Now, I work a lot with life cycle assessment and carbon footprinting, and in our methodology world, we used to talk about two different things here, about transformation impacts and occupation impacts. And in the IPCC world, the climate panel, it's talk about land use change and land use. And land use change, that is obviously when we do something dramatic as here, that is converting a forest into agricultural land, and this picture here is from the Amazon. And those land use changes, I will talk about CO2 emissions, but of course extremely big impact on biodiversity, on water hydrology, so this is a very bad impact actually. And if we look at the emissions of carbon dioxide in a longer perspective, and you can see here that land use change has actually been quite a big part of this. And the blue one here, that is CO2 from fossil fuels. But if you see the green parts, you can see that especially in the 100 years ago, there were a lot of CO2 emissions from the land use change. A lot of this, of course, from North America, where we lost a lot of soil carbon, is responsible here. But now in the later years, it's very much land use change in the tropics, and it's around 9% of all CO2 emissions today. The positive thing is that there has been going downward trends, because Brazil have done a lot of work here in recent years, but it's still a big part. When you're going to try to calculate that in a food product, you get a lot of problems. And we did this in a work some years ago, where we looked at producing beef on pasture in Brazil. Well, almost all beef is produced on pasture. And we have these typical methane, nitrous oxide, but we also wanted to include native forest, the land use change, the pasture expansion into native forest. And one of the things here when you do deforestation, which is typical for South America, is that you have a lot of different land uses after the deforestation. Normally you would think that you deforest and then you have agriculture for all the time, but in practice you can have regrowth, or you can deforest and leave the land at once. So actually you deforest much more land than it's actually used as agricultural land. So you have a lot of land use conversion afterwards, and depending on these one, there will be different emissions of the carbon dioxide. We tried to solve this, and what we did in this, we tried to see how much land is converted from forest into pasture. And when you convert that, you burn the forest, you take out some trees, and then you put pasture, and you will have carbon dioxide emission over several years. And the question is here, when we want to put this in a carbon footprint, we have to distribute these emissions for the products from this pasture or the agricultural land, and then we have to know how is the land used afterwards. And we also have to find out how many years should we do this for. And when we calculated for this, we got extremely high land use change emissions. So this is when you convert 1 hectare of Amazon forest into agricultural land. It's a total emission, this transformation of land, of over 600 tons CO2. It's extremely a lot. It's very much. But it's also a very, very high uncertainty, which is due to that there is a big variation in the carbon content in the original forest. And this is one very important thing to think of when you see numbers, that they are associated with big uncertainties. In the Amazon, they take out some timber, so we want to say that some of the timber products should be responsible for this emission. It's only about 6%. Most of it is actually burned up. And from that, we put rest of the emission for the products from agriculture, and we distributed these emissions over 20 years. And that is typically what you do in Europe when you try to calculate land use change emissions for biofuels that have increased, that have put some land use change. Then the tricky thing here is, where is the deforestation and where is the beef growth? And if we look at Brazil, who has become a major beef exporter in the world, we can see that the growth in beef, the total growth of beef production, is very much driven by the export. So it's the export markets that want this. And most of the beef export is actually going from these non-deforestation parts of the world, parts of Brazil, where we have the deforestation up in the Amazon region. And sometimes the buyers or the exporters say that we buy beef from non-deforestation states, so it's not our problem. You can quite often hear that. When we looked at the numbers then, and you see how much importance this is, I will try to get you through here. If we look at 1 kilo of beef in Brazil, without any land use emissions, we have around 28 kilo of carbon dioxide equivalents. And we can see that quite a lot of this is methane. And that is because we have quite high slaughter ages, and the suckling cows, they are quite long periods when they are not getting pregnant, so you have quite inefficient stock going there. If we compare with Europe and Sweden, we are around 20 here. When we then added these land use change emissions, we did it in different system boundary, and the first one, which is a terrible number, is this one, adding over 700 kilo of CO2 per kilo of meat. And that is if you look at 1 hectare of transferred land producing beef for 20 years, and that direct impact of that beef, and you would have this huge number. And that you could say, if you, okay, I don't buy beef from directly deforested land, so I have no responsibility. But we added this, we distributed this emission for the whole Amazon production in the forest, and also all over the whole country. And still, if you distribute it for the whole production, you can see it's a very, very big carbon footprint still. And the thing here is that, where do you put your system boundary? And actually there is no self-evident rule how to do this in carbon footprinting today. And we can see this problem also in when we look at the biofuel discussion. And biofuels have got the good credit that they are growing biomass. They take up CO2 from the atmosphere, and you don't put any CO2 emissions when you use the biofuel, because it's thinking about going around all the time. But what we have in practice is that when we introduce a new demand for biomass, somewhere in the world there will have to be some type of land use change to fulfill that demand, unless you intensify the rest of the production very much. And these indirect effects, when you are not including them, will give a quite positive way of looking at biomass. And now what the research are working with, and we are trying to work with this also in my research group, to look for the growing demand for soy meal, because there is such a big growing demand for soy all over the world, and we got these indirect land use change effects. But this is basically what they do in the models, where they try to understand how are the biofuels inflicting on land use change. And actually it's like economic models, which are related together with land use models. And you see how an increased demand for a crop, that will have different effects. The price will go up, and then some will ask for less of this crop, but there will also be an intensified production. This could be maize in the United States, which have gone up in price a lot due to ethanol production, actually. And then you start to cultivate this crop on previous land, or you replace crop from something else, and you go on and on and on and on. And somewhere in the end of this chain, you would probably have an indirect land use change. This is popularly called for ILUC factors. And if you look at the biofuel here, when you try to put a number of ILUC impact, you can see that different researchers have put very different numbers here. And the differences in these numbers, I think it's a sign of telling how very, very complex it is to actually say what's happening when we are indirectly changing land anywhere. And if we think that burning 1 megajoule of gasoline will emit around 90 grams of CO2, you can see that you could actually have all the benefit being eaten up only by this land use change. This is one of the background why the EU Commission now have changed their policy to say that 10% of the biofuels should be from, they should be new renewable biofuels, and now they have set a limit that it's only half of this that can be from food crops. And this is due to the uncertainties of land use change. So when we are working with all this data to understand land use change, because it's 9% of all emissions of carbon dioxide that actually has not been involved in this carbon footprinting of products, we have a lot of problems. We have data problems with areas, how the land use is, and also carbon stock. And we have these methodology problems where especially these indirect effects are very, very difficult to take into account. And that means I also often get the question, how much emission is 1 kilo of soy meal? What's the look factor? What's the land use change factor for soy meal? And it's very, very difficult because I think you have to do some of this indirect modeling to understand what is pushing the demand for soy meal. And I believe that these very high numbers that you saw from my Brazilian beef, because the land price is going up in Brazil, that means that you push the cattle towards the Amazon, and the old grassland in the old part of Brazil is grown for soy and for sugarcane, so you have these indirect effects. And yet we have not modeled that or understood that in a proper way. I will say something about occupation now, and I try to split transformation impact and occupation. And occupation, this is a tractor where you take salix, willow, you grow willow. And here I want to know, if I start the 1st of January and end the last of December, and I have done a lot of activity on that field, is this activity giving emissions from soil, or are they giving carbon sequestration? So that's more like occupation impacts. And here we have this problem with verifying soil carbon changes. And I just made an example from a good arable land in Sweden, where we have maybe a carbon stock of 75 ton carbon. And we say that we do an action here, so we can start to do a carbon sequestration corresponding to 400 kilo carbon per hectare and year. And as you understand from the former speakers, we have to do quite a lot to get this. Now, this is quite a lot, 400 kilo carbon per hectare and year. That's almost 1.5 tons CO2. And if you drive with diesel, 80 litre per hectare, you will have emission of around 250 kilos. So it's quite a lot. However, sorry, I forgot to translate. If you look after the first year, 400 kilo, that is only 0.5% in relation to the total stock. And that is actually difficult or impossible to measure with a soil sample. But after 25 years, we will have a seed stock increase by 10 ton, and that is measurable. But again, time factor here is extremely important. So how many years can we have this increase? Because we have saturation. So because this is so difficult, we have to work with models to try to understand what's happening in the soil, if it's going up or going down. And Keith Golding showed the Rothamsted model, and this is a Danish model, where you actually look at different pools in the soil and how they respond. And very important in these models is how much carbon input you have from crop residues and manure, how much carbon you have in the soil from the beginning, temperature, and so on. And we also have these questions like tillage. Does tillage mean anything or not? So there are really question marks here. And this is one example from this model that we work with, where just to see you how much we calculate for crop residues in different crops, how much carbon will go into the soil from different crops. And we look here at maize silage and grass silage because we have been looking to that. People in Sweden now, farmers in South Sweden, tend to go over to maize silage instead of grass. And okay, we get much more on the top, we get more yield, but we get a much poorer root system. And I think it's a very good question to ask, what will that do for soil carbon? So we are looking in a study here for dairy in Västra Götaland, and that's in the west of Sweden, north of Gothenburg. And this is an area with a lot of cattle, a big share of the Swedish dairy production, and a long tradition. And here we were comparing to see if there are some major impact on soil carbon when we look at different types of feed diets. And here would be some type of baseline where we have about 60% of the feed, dry matter, coming from grassland. This is an alternative where we replace some of the grassland with maize silage and also some byproducts from the sugar industry. And then we have this third option where we put more grass into the diet, the good grass, and then we can reduce grain and concentrates a bit. Now the land use here, the feed, you can see how much feed one cow has to eat to produce the milk, and there is quite a big difference. We have more grassland here and less grain and concentrates in this third alternative. And when we look at this for the whole system, what we have looked here, we have modeled farms where we have the grass and the maize and the grain all grown at the farm, and we buy the concentrates. That's actually the normal procedure in this part of Sweden. We can see here that it's quite different how much grassland you have in the different alternatives, and you have quite less grassland in this one. There is another important thing here, and it's also that the maize alternative requires less total arable land to produce the same amount of milk. And if we had put this in Öland, in the south or east of Sweden, where it's quite dry and it's not so good for grassland, but it's good for maize, I think the differences would have been bigger in the land area to produce 1 kilo of milk. If we look at the greenhouse gas emissions for this whole system here, not including anything from land use and land use change, they are very, very similar. It's around 1.1 kilo CO2 equivalents per kilo of milk. And when we model this and try to understand how different ways of choosing this feed, growing more maize or less maize or more grass, or very much more grass, trying to understand what will happen with soil carbon changes. There is one very obvious thing here, and it's when we test this, how much carbon do you have in the soil from the beginning? That seemed to be one of the most vital things to understand here. And we used soil sampling from this area of Sweden, and now we are certainly not talking of degraded soils. These are very, very good soils. And in the Swedish soil sampling, the cattle farms in this area, they have a soil carbon of around 2.5 in average. There have been cattle for a long time, and we don't get so much raising up of soil carbon because I think they are very close to some sort of equilibrium. So this is not degraded soil. So we can track some soil carbon changes, but when we put them into the, compare them with this total greenhouse gas emissions from milk, it's not that they can compensate a lot actually, maximum 10%, even that. And my belief is here that we already had a quite good soil carbon status here. When we have these feed rations where we put in maize instead of grass, they seem to lose soil carbon. And I think this is an interesting thing. And now we see in Sweden and Denmark that maize is increasing on the benefit of grassland. However, feed rations with maize, they also tend to have a lower total land requirement. So if you are going to do some whole system analysis, how is this surplus land use? If you get maybe 10–15% less land, you could plant forest as a carbon sink on that land. Or this is option. And I would like to say with Keith here, when you do this and try to understand grassland, this is temporary grassland, but it's still like 3 years, and you plow them and then you put them back, 3 years plow them. So it's a very short time that when they are open. When we do this soil carbon modeling, you understand that there is quite gap knowledge when it comes to how much crop residues you get from grassland and how you get all the soil organic matter turning around. And here is really need for much more research. And also if we are going for these deep-rooted crops to understand grassland, how we can benefit and what type of management and they are. You know, other crops, if you have wheat, the bigger wheat yield you have, normally you have a bigger root. But in grassland, it may be because they grow all year around, so the yield doesn't maybe need to be so important. I have done this in extremely hurry due to we have the former speakers. I wanted our international guests to talk a bit more. I say thank you, and we can have some short questions. I'm sorry about the speedy thing, but it was a bit because of this, my sick colleague also. Thank you.